Hello, everybody, and welcome to this event at Stanford. My name's Alexander Key. I'm a professor of comparative literature here, working on Arabic literature. Before I was an academic, I was a human rights and development professional in Palestine and in the West, and in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. I'd like to start by reading the Abbasi program's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwakema Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. And consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to honor and make visible the university's relationship to Indigenous people. I'd also like to read one of the panelists who is also on the West Coast of America, a little bit north of us. I'd like to read Karam Dana's land acknowledgement, because I think it's particularly well put. And these individual choices, these individual ethical choices that we all make about how we talk about our lives are pertinent to this event. Karam's acknowledgement says, "I acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I recognize that UW Bothell campus specifically sits on the original territory belonging to the Willow Sammamish people. Campus also touches on the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tualip, and Muckleshoot nations. I am grateful to be a guest in these lands and commit to show solidarity for the continued fight for Indigenous sovereignty." So here we are in California. This is an informational event for the Stanford community. What we've done is we've taken 6 scholars who work on aspects of Israel and Palestine in different disciplines. We've got these 6 scholars in 3 separate panels today, and then 2 panels next week. We are cognizant in the community that this is a matter of life and death. This, as other than other kind of cultural points of discussion in California at the moment, this is a matter in which people are living and people are dying, and we take it very seriously as a result of that. I would like to thank, in terms of the organization, the Abbasi program, the sponsoring departments, particularly my colleague Lisa Blades, the director of the Abbasi program, for her leadership on this, and my colleagues Alita DePeron and Colin Hamill, who've been fundamental in setting it up. Today, the first of 3 panels, we have 2 professors with us. We have Professor Shira Robinson, who is an associate professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. And we have Professor Karam Dana, who is an associate professor at the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at U Washington Bothell. And rather than run you through their tremendous CVs, I'm just going to read very briefly a couple of things from their publications. So to start with, a couple of sentences, and then you'll get a lot more from their presentations. In the conclusion of Shira's book, she writes about the liberal state of Israel. "The composite shape of the state was a product of its time, a crossroads in international approaches to problems posed by heterogeneous polities in a post-Nazi and ostensibly decolonizing world." That kind of international product of the time framing is exactly why we have a historian on this panel. From a recent article by Karam, he writes that while Westerners consider human rights and democracy to be hallmarks of civilization, there is increasing evidence that faith in these concepts is wavering in American society, where support for these ideals are now edging closer to levels found in Palestine. Again, that connection between where we are in this moment in the United States of America and California and what life is like in Palestine and how we think about democracy is very pertinent to what we're talking about today. Professor Robinson will speak first for about 15 minutes. She'll be followed by Professor Dana, They'll then both have kind of a 5-10 minute chance to feed off ideas that the other one raised, and then we'll be opening it up to a moderated question and answer session. So please, like, put your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom or in the chat. We'll read them and we'll run them past the panelists. Thank you all ever so much for coming. Thank you to the 2 participants. I will pass it over to Shira Robinson.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. And some of you may know that I actually got my PhD in history at Stanford. So it's nice to be virtually back, if not back in person. The last 3 weeks in Israel-Palestine have been a whirlwind, to say the least. For the first time since the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the entirety of the territory that Israel controls, from the Jordanian River to the Mediterranean Sea, has been engulfed in horrifying violence. It has also been immersed in an outpouring of Palestinian protests that perhaps since 1987 or possibly 1936 has not seen so much unity of purpose. I'm just going to give a brief rundown of the events of the last few weeks. In East Jerusalem, the Israeli police raided the Aqsa Mosque during the Eid al-Fitr holiday and barred Ramadan gatherings outside Damascus Gate in the Old City, where the mosque sits. Jewish settlers, flanked by Israeli soldiers, meanwhile moved to evict a group of 300 Palestinians from about 13 extended families from the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. In Gaza, Israel carried out an 11-day aerial bombardment that left an estimated 230 Palestinians dead, 1,900 injured, and 59,000 people homeless. Hamas-fired rockets also killed 12 Israeli Jews. In protests in the West Bank, the Israeli army has killed at least 17 Palestinians in recent days. And inside the 78% of historic Palestine that Israel conquered in 1948, what people often refer to as Israel proper, Jewish mobs attacked their Palestinian co-citizens, often as the authorities stood by and did nothing, or with their help. In the last 3 weeks, the police have placed many Palestinian communities inside 48 Israel under quasi-military occupation, and the police have detained nearly 2,000 Palestinian citizens who dared to protest the events in Jerusalem, the increasingly explicit pillars of Jewish supremacy that oppresses them in their own communities and their own country, and the ongoing occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, as a historian of Israel-Palestine, I want to reflect on the ways in which this moment is the result of both short and long-term developments. And at the end, or maybe after Karam offers his remarks, I'll talk about what I see as new. Now, in one sense, the events of the last few weeks represent the culmination of what we've all recognized as the ultra-nationalist and supremacist lurch in Israeli politics over the past 2 decades. Since the start of the Second Intifada, or Palestinian uprising against the occupation, a shift toward an open embrace of racist chauvinism has emerged in Israel, and that has produced a widespread view of Palestinian life as disposable. Within Israel's 1948 armistice lines, the democratically elected parliament, or Knesset, has passed a battery of new laws since 2000, but especially since 2009, designed to remove Palestinian citizens, who number 1/5 of the entire population, to remove them from public life and to facilitate their ongoing dispossession in the south, in the Naqab or Negev desert, and in the north, in the Galilee. Together with the army, the Knesset has taken also unprecedented steps to annex the already racially segregated West Bank, where some 622,000 Jewish settlers and some 3 million stateless Palestinians live under separate and unequal laws. The Knesset has also backed the deepening pulverization of the Gaza Strip, where for the past 14 years, 2 million more stateless Palestinians have been living under a devastating blockade that has severely curtailed their access to employment, but also to food, clean water, and medical care. The peak of this legislative assault came with the passage in July 2018 of the nation-state law, which promulgated the right to self-determination in Israel as unique to the Jewish people, quote unquote, and it promulgated the development of Jewish settlement as a national value. So all that we can say is, I would argue, is the culmination of 20 years of this ultra-nationalist supremacist lurch. And yet, there's always an and yet. So at the same time, I argue, it would be a mistake to accept the common refrain that the ascendance of Israel's settler right represents a tragic perversion of the original national dream or an abandonment of the state's foundational commitments to equality and pluralism. For the past century, the Jewish settler project in Palestine has been dogged by an existential conflict between territory and demography, the challenge of creating a modern Jewish republic in a land inhabited by another people. This challenge cannot be overstated. I'm going to go into a bit of detail here because it is completely erased from the diplomatic conversation about the 1967 and the so-called two-state solution, or the idea of the two-state solution. Throughout British mandatory rule in Palestine from 1917 to 1947, the settler leadership of the Jewish community, or Yishuv, worried that Palestine's Arab majority might win their struggle for national self-determination before the growing Jewish immigrant population could achieve a sufficiently critical size to claim the country for itself. In 1917, the Jewish population numbered about 10% of the total population of Palestine. This did not happen. The growing Jewish immigrant population did not succeed in claiming the country for itself, and it did not achieve a sufficiently critical size to do so. And when the UN, the United Nations, voted to partition Palestine in 1947, nearly half of the population living in the territory allotted to the Jewish state was projected to be Arab. In 1948, the Zionist leadership significantly reduced this political threat, not a security threat, but a political threat, by expelling and expanding the flight of the majority of the Arab population within the 78% of Palestine that Israel conquered. Soon thereafter, the parliamentary structure that Israel's new leaders put in place was premised on ensuring the irreversibility of its sweeping demographic and territorial accomplishments. The state invested extraordinary resources then to prevent Palestinian refugees from returning to their homes by militarizing the armistice lines, passing new legislation to expropriate the land and property of Palestinian refugees, and by financing the settlement of new Jewish immigrants throughout the depopulated countryside. And yet a nagging problem remained. While the minority of Palestinian Arabs who had managed to stay put within the state's armistice lines comprised only 15% of Israel's population, that 15% held a much larger portion of Israel's land mass. This territory, and this is might seem like it's in the weeds, but it's actually, I think, tremendously important. This territory that was held by the Palestinians who remained in Israel after 1948 included large areas that had been allocated to the future Palestinian state by the UN partition plan. And many Israeli officials expressed concern that the Arabs living in these areas would continue to demand their right to self-determination. And so in early 1949, soon after the government reluctantly agreed to grant suffrage to these Palestinians in order to strengthen Israel's membership bid at the United Nations, the government set out to gut the power of their vote. And it did this in two ways. The first way it set out to gut the power of their vote was by institutionalizing a draconian military regime that effectively removed Palestinians from the public's Republican sovereignty that Jews in Israel enjoyed. For the first 18 years of statehood until late 1966, Israel made use of movement restrictions, political detention, surveillance, censorship, and more on Palestinian citizens of the state as a way to colonize Palestinian land, protect Jewish labor, and uphold segregation between the two populations. A second early move by the Israeli government to gut the power of the Palestinian vote after 1948 was to delay any parliamentary discussion on a citizenship bill until the government could figure out how to avoid enshrining Arab-Jewish equality into law. The 1950 Law of Return, which created a separate legal status that superseded the status of citizen, clarified the exclusive rights of the Jewish people to the state, not merely rights within it, regardless of where in the world those Jews lived. 2 years later, the 1952 Citizenship Law distinguished between those residents who enjoyed automatic legal status by virtue of the Law of Return, i.e. all Jews, and everyone else, i.e. the Palestinian Arabs who remained in the country, who would need to meet a range of conditions to become citizens. These two laws, the law of return in 1950 and the law of citizenship in 1952, established the original legal foundations for Jewish supremacy in Israel, along with the ban on Palestinian refugee return. Now, by the early 1960s, we're fast forwarding here a bit, the military regime imposed on Palestinian citizens had facilitated successfully the expropriation of roughly 80% of their lands and left much of the population impoverished, socially marginalized, and politically divided. This outcome, coupled with changing economic conditions and the fact that growing Palestinian protests to end the regime was beginning to render military rule a political liability. And this is the liability that led Israel to dismantle the military regime in December 1966, quietly transferring the emergency regulations that made it possible to the civilian police. Now, I want to be clear. The government in Israel did not end military rule over its Palestinian minority because the government had ceased to view Palestinian citizens as a potential political threat. Growing numbers among those citizens continued to demand the right of return for their compatriots in exile and the end of Jewish privilege in every sphere of social, economic, and political life. Instead, because Israel's existential demographic crisis had been addressed, the authorities viewed this political threat posed by Palestinian citizens as containable, and the state had less visible mechanisms of controlling them. So that sounds like they kind of solved the demographic problem. But just 6 months later, Israel's demographic dilemma was rekindled when it conquered over 1 million more Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There were different conditions associated with this conquest, but there were the same political challenges that we saw after 1948. So what were some of these conditions, and different conditions, but same political challenges? In part because the war ended so quickly, it lasted only 6 days, the collective flight and expulsions that attended the 1948 war did not reoccur. There were 345,000 more Palestinian refugees as a result of the 1967 war, some of whom became refugees for a second time. But the population and the institutions of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and including East Jerusalem and the West Bank, had largely remained intact. Unlike 20 years earlier in 1948, in 1967, the Palestinians were also breathing new air into their national movement, and the world was in the throes of decolonization and civil rights struggles. Israel knew that it needed to avoid the appearance of moving against the tide of history. Its leaders spoke openly, at least in Hebrew, of the need not to become another South Africa, which was being shunned by the international community. At the same time, the Israeli government, the Knesset, and the public would not countenance the extension of suffrage rights to a group of people that because of the group of Palestinians, that because of their size, there were over 1 million of them, and there were at that point maybe 2.3 million Israeli Jewish citizens, that because of their size would quickly legislate away the pillars of Jewish privilege, including the ban on Palestinian refugee return. But these concerns, were accompanied by an overwhelming euphoria over the prospect of settling the new territories, a messianic vision that appealed as much to veteran secular Jewish Israeli leaders, as their newly emboldened national religious counterparts. And so, rather than withdraw from the territories that Israel had occupied in the pursuit of one of a handful of political agreements proposed after the '67 war, Israel committed itself to holding on to the territories while refusing to grant any rights to its Palestinian inhabitants. In effect, as other scholars have suggested, it decided not to decide. The broad strokes of the subsequent decades have already been told by scholars. Jewish settlement was facilitated to different degrees by the Zionist left and the Zionist right. There was brutal political repression of the occupation emerged in response to the Palestinian demands in the occupied territories to end the occupation to stop the confiscation of their land from underneath their feet, and to create the establishment of a Palestinian state. The possibility of a Palestinian state was fading further and further each year as the expansion of Jewish settlements and Jewish settlers in both the West Bank and Gaza, as well as inside still heavily Palestinian regions of 1948 Israel, led to the growing erasure of the 1967 lines for Jews and the lines between Jews and Arabs more generally. And I can come back to this moment if you'd like me to. But basically, the establishment of Jewish settlements, more Jewish settlements than before, inside the Palestinian Galilee and the largely Palestinian Naqab, and the establishment of Jewish settlers in Gaza and the West Bank was creating a situation in which Palestinians and Jews, even though they lived under, especially in the occupied territories, lived under separate laws, they were bumping up against each other more and more. You had large numbers of Palestinians working in Jewish settlements, for example, often helping to build them. You had large numbers of Palestinians from the occupied territories working inside Israel, 1948 Israel, and you had growing numbers of Palestinians from inside 48 Israel increasingly becoming part of the larger Israeli fabric in terms of employment and industry and education. So Palestinians and Jews were mixing more than ever before. Ultimately, the occupied Palestinians of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip rose up in 1987. The first Intifada was a massive grassroots campaign to end the occupation. It was largely nonviolent. And it did successfully convince Israeli Jews that the price of occupation was too high to pay. But the conclusion that elected Israeli officials took from this fact that Israeli Jews were convinced that the occupation was too expensive, basically too pricey, in the sense that it was causing like a downturn in the economy, tourism was down, Palestinians were boycotting Israeli goods, and also Israel just looked terrible by having soldiers chase children in the alleys of refugee camps. The conclusion that elected politicians took was not to end the occupation, but to reconfigure it by attempting to return to the idea of partition. Not so much the partition of land, because Israel wanted to keep as much Palestinian land in the West Bank and Gaza as possible, but to partition the people, the Arabs, the Palestinians, and the Jews. We see after the first Intifada the establishment of a closure regime on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, in which it became much, much harder for Palestinian laborers who were used to more or less being able to get into Israel to do construction jobs and things like service jobs and things like this. That became almost impossible overnight in the early 1990s. We see this with the Oslo Accords, which established these different areas of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, most of which was effectively annexed by Israel, where the Palestinian Authority, which was created as a powerless mechanism by design, had no authority, and smaller areas of where the Palestinian population was very dominant, where the PA shared security responsibility with Israel, or it sort of enjoyed fake security authorities in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. During the Oslo years, from 1993 until roughly 2000, depending on how you count it, the settler population in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but especially the West Bank, doubled, and the infrastructure to facilitate their movement in and out of West Bank and back in Gaza and back into 48 Israel expanded. So here we have bypass roads, all kinds of more water redirection, allocation of water to serve the settlers at the expense of Palestinian water consumption, and more. The deprivation of Oslo, the closure that was created on Palestinians, the impossibility of Palestinians to find work, the repression of the Palestinian Authority, the failure of the Palestinian Authority to actually end the occupation, all of that led to the second Intifada, or the second Palestinian uprising in Gaza, second Palestinian uprising in the West Bank and Gaza. And so then we have even more attempts to separate the population, the separation wall, the siege on Gaza that was imposed after Hamas won the elections in 2000, and new laws that have been established ever since 2000 to try to remove Palestinians from public, in Israel 48, from public life. But what I want to sort of suggest here is that separation, what we see now and what we're seeing now inside Palestine and Israel is that separation as a project and as a strategy has failed, because Israel continues to try to take Palestinian land without its Palestinian inhabitants. The old formula has broken down, maybe because there is simply nowhere left to go within Palestine for the Palestinians to go. Maybe because a people can only be deprived of their rights for so long, and maybe because we have a different international climate that is no longer willing to tolerate the conditions on the ground. So I'll stop it, I'll leave it at that. I hope that wasn't too overwhelming, too many facty tidbits, and that's it. Oh, Alexander, you're muted.
Thanks, Shira. I'll pass it over to Karam.
Thank you very much, Shira, and thank you, Alexander. I want to continue on various conversations that Shira had started with, but to comment on a couple of things. But what I want to do here is highlight 4 particular angles through which we should, from my perspective, think about the recent events. The first is that popular mobilization is not new in Palestinian society or history. And also unity isn't necessarily new either. We saw mobilization and unity in 1929 during what is known as the Buraq Wall riots, where there was a perceived threat to the Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount, as it is called. We also saw that in 1936 with the general strike and the Arab Revolt that was meant in some ways to point the finger at the British authorities that were allowing, in some ways, various institutions for the Yishuv, or the Jewish community in Palestine before 1948. They allowed the establishment of those institutions that in some ways in 1948 became the institutions of a state, while not allowing institutions for Palestinians to emerge. So Palestinians have had general strikes in the past. They have had revolts in a variety of different modes or modalities of resistance. But also I'd like to speak about the fact that the Palestinians in 1987 during the first Intifada were united and had one of the largest popular mobilizations in recent memory. As well as in the year 2000 during the second Intifada, which also witnessed unity, but also popular mobilization. However, this particular event 2000 on was characterized with a great deal of violence, which I will be describing later. So that's the first thing I'd like to talk about. The second is how colonial reactions have traditionally dealt with the Palestinians when there is a popular mobilization against certain policies. The first, well, instead of talking about the first, but let me describe that particular policy. It is a colonial reaction that is really characterized by the violent divide and conquer idea. And in a sense, the fragmentation of Palestinian society is at the very heart of this divide and conquer. This happened in 1936, for example, when the British killed, exiled, and imprisoned Palestinians. In addition to this, I want to talk about the various policies that were utilized to divide and conquer effectively. So obviously in 1948, the Nakba brought a destruction, a form of destruction to the Palestinian society. And obviously its effects continue to this day, especially that more than half the Palestinians that exist on the face of this earth happen to be outside of what was once known as Palestine or Mandatory Palestine. But the interesting thing is that the newly established state articulated a division between its Jewish population and those Palestinians who did not leave or became refugees. They didn't leave their homes in what is known now as Israel today. Those Palestinians are not necessarily integrated, quote unquote, as we use this terminology in modern times. They're not integrated into larger society as oftentimes it is portrayed. They have been discriminated systematically, and there are a ton of research out there that proves that. But one thing I'd like to mention is that this was not unintentional, it was by design. as also my colleague Shira Robinson mentioned earlier. In fact, those Palestinians inside Israel were not allowed to leave their own villages and towns for a 20-year period up until 1968. Now, in 1967, going back 1 year in history, the fragmentation of Palestinian society continues on the hands of Israel, with the Naksa, or the Six-Day War, when a second wave of refugees were forced out of Palestine, and also the occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and other territories belonging to Syria, southern Lebanon, and of course, Egypt. Now, the interesting thing is that this fragmentation continues, and the targeting of Palestinian community is something that has persisted continuously. The same thing happened in 1987. Let me give you an example. The administrative detention policy of 1936 was a British mandate directive to arrest and detain Palestinians for 6 months at a time without a charge. Israel, decades later, used this very directive to imprison Palestinians without a charge for up to 6 months, renewable indefinitely. The 1987 Intifada brought, at the end of it, the Oslo Accords. But the post-Oslo policy on the ground was not only about the separation of Palestinians from the Israelis in what is often dubbed as peace through separation, or land for peace, but it also was around expansion of Israeli settlements or colonies, which currently amount to more than 400 settlements in the West Bank. But also pursued effectively the post-Oslo Israeli policy was a revised policy that further entrenched the dividing of Palestinian society. Shira has mentioned some of that earlier. Let me give you an example. The wall, the infamous wall, often talked about as a separation wall, or the apartheid wall, is one that separates Palestinians from Palestinians more than it actually separates Palestinians from Jewish Israeli settlers or Jewish Israelis. Okay? The checkpoint policy, for example, and the permit regime that is actually more than 100 different types of regimes that are meant in some ways to keep Palestinians bound to particular geographic areas. And obviously the checkpoint policy is one that creates an intentional dismemberment effectively of Palestinians from going from one place to another. Palestinian life has been fully controlled in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, controlled by Israeli occupation, and to a similar type of policy, but somewhat different, is one that has targeted Palestinians living inside Israel. Now, this has had obviously drastic negative consequences on Palestinian socioeconomic and political life. All you need to do is kind of read some of the reports about Gaza for you to get a picture that is quite dire, unfortunately. One thing I'd like to mention in relation to what Shira spoke about the erasure of the 1948 lines for Jewish Israelis, that the idea of expansion is something that is part of the Zionist project. However, it might be the erasure of the lines for the Jewish Israelis. This has been felt and experienced quite differently for Palestinians. It was about further dismemberment and emphasis on their exclusion from access to their own towns, created the inability for continued connections with relatives in Jerusalem, for example, and in 1948 relative territories, right, or in 1948 in Israel. So that is the second thing I'd like to that I wanted to mention. But 2000, around 2000, there was a new type of transformation that I'd like to address, which will actually bring us to point 3 and 4 that I'd like to discuss and talk about. So the context of war and terror after 9/11, with a heightened Orientalist views of the terrorist Arab or Muslim or Palestinian, which I think of them as a trifecta in some ways of identities, coupled with the Cold War policies that have increased, they have led to an increased level of more or less sanctioned violence against Palestinians. And for the first time since 1967, Palestinians saw tanks in the West Bank, in the streets of West Bank, and the amount of destruction was quite high and quite noticeable. So this, in some ways, necessitated for Palestinians to kind of move and start thinking of new ways to resist the brutality of the occupation and the Israeli state. And it's interesting because the fight seemed to be one that needed to have new territories or new fronts, if I may. And that in some ways started taking place outside of mandatory Palestine. And it materialized in different ways. For example, the so-called boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, is a campaign that is a nonviolent form of resistant Israeli occupation that is meant in some ways to target particular companies, particular policies that have discriminated systematically against Palestinians. The interesting thing about BDS is that it operates more like a social movement. It is not centralized per se. There isn't one particular person or one group of people that are the ones who are designing it. It becomes an individual way, if I may, right? It's a social movement where people believe in certain ideas that they themselves pursue. So it's an animal of its own, if I may, right? So BDS has materialized in the years after that brutality of Israeli occupation was noticed in the West Bank. And it emerged because a group of civil society leaders came together and they actually called for the international community's help dealing with this. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this was the first time that transnational Palestinian politics has come into the picture, but it has become more emphasized in the years after the heightened violence perpetrated against Palestinians by Israel. Now, let me talk, this leads me effectively to the fourth point that I would like to make, which is that Palestinians in exile, but also in Palestine, have agency. Let me talk a little bit more about Palestinians who are in exile. From 1948, there was an intentional, as I mentioned earlier, there's an intentional dismemberment of Palestinian society. This led to kind of a growing network of Palestinians living outside of mandatory Palestine. But it also allowed these Palestinians to build their own lives in the diaspora and allowed them to forge new connections to these new places where they ended up settling. More importantly, they forged new connections of solidarity with marginalized groups, other marginalized groups. Examples of this is the Black Lives Matter movement, connections with the Latino and Latinx community in the United States, and even Jewish Americans in the United States. Decolonization was at the heart and has been at the heart of that Palestinian argument, that it's a responsibility for people to take a stand. In addition to that, the civil rights has played a role in terms of speaking about Palestinian rights that have been denied by the state of Israel. Another thing I'd like to mention is that the word apartheid, comparing the experience of Black South Africans, is one that really has allowed Palestinians to speak about their struggle in transnational ways. And there's power to that. In 2006, former President Jimmy Carter wrote a book called Palestine, Peace or Apartheid. And the very fact that this came in the title highlights the significance of the policies that have discriminated against Palestinians for a former president to effectively put that at the heart of the title of the book that he published in 2006. Now, Palestinians have changed the narrative that they are, in some ways, they are the ones who are writing their narrative nowadays. Thanks to the internet, thanks to technological advancement of social media, that has allowed some of those voices to emerge and to be, in a sense, further away from the reach of the Israeli state, because those individuals and groups, they live in a transnational setting, and not in the West Bank, not in Gaza, and not inside Israel. So increasingly, if the analogy would go is that the chicken came home to roost without the geographic sense per se. but rather that this intentional dismemberment of Palestinian society has become, in some ways, the challenge that is faced by the State of Israel and its policies. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Karam. Shira.
Okay, thank you, Karam. That was great. Yeah, I want to pick up on some of the points that Karam made towards the end about the sort of the uprising, sort of growing discursive and actual sort of logistical and physical uprising that is taking place right now. And I'll start off by saying that, I mean, the term apartheid as a political charge and a kind of political mechanism to put pressure on Israel is something that Palestinians were talking about for decades. And is only in recent times, as human rights organizations, as recently as last month or earlier this month, like Human Rights Watch, prior to that, B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Organization, and others have only then has the term apartheid sort of been really coming into the mainstream among non-leftists, like among just everyday ordinary Americans. So that's both really important. It's really important to remember that Palestinians had been saying this for a long time before these organizations started saying it themselves, but it's incredibly valuable, I think, and important, because we can read their reports and look at the ways in which they are tracing the origins of this apartheid regime and tracing its development and its enforcement, and we can use that as further political leverage to demand change. In many ways, I see the term apartheid. I mean, I remember when the term apartheid was beginning to come into the American sort of public discussion among leftists about almost 20 years ago. And it strikes me that now that word is no longer it's no longer as politically charged because it's been successfully mainstreamed. But one of the things that's interesting to me, and I'm thinking of writing something about this with my colleague Rebecca Stein at Duke in the anthropology department, is the language of Jewish supremacy. And I actually used that language in an essay that I wrote. I first wrote it after the second election in Israel in 2019, and I wrote an article that was published in an edited volume called "Supremacy Unleashed: The Ongoing Erosion of Palestinian Citizen Rights in Israel." But I think that supremacy is in certain ways the new apartheid, in the sense that growing numbers of Israeli Jewish critics and American leftists and other leftists in Europe and Palestinian analysts are talking about the nature of Jewish supremacy in Israel in ways that I think are new and really I think reflective of the Trump era, and as Karam said, the Black Lives Matter movement, and sort of the comfort with which white Americans and Black Americans and all Americans have developed in talking about white supremacy in this country, and the sort of awareness and recognition that white supremacy is not only about white privilege, it's about the beliefs of white supremacy and the actions of white supremacy, or the structures of it, that continue to perpetuate structural racism in this country. So I think that's an interesting transnational connection that I just wanted to follow up on from Karam. And the other thing that I think is new, and another thing I think is really interesting and new is, at least to my mind, and I think I said this to Karam earlier today, the language of from the river to the sea, that used to be seen as something that was like really contentious and controversial. And Mark Lamont Hill was fired from his position at CNN. He's a professor at Temple. He was fired from his kind of routine gig at CNN, his analyst gig, because he made a reference to from the river to the sea, the expression, in a speech that he gave to the UN about Palestinian rights. And it seems like in the last few weeks, I could be wrong, but it's just my sense that because Palestinian voices are being centered and uplifted more and more and more, and because the uprising taking place is happening in all the territories that Israel controls right now and has controlled since either 1948 or 1967, because the uprisings are happening everywhere and the demands to end settler colonization are the same, we see a growing a growing acceptance of and repetition, invocation of the term "from the river to the sea." And it used to be that the language of from the river to the sea was an old sort of phrase that was sort of coined. I don't know if it was coined or invoked by Fatah, the Palestinian liberation resistance movement. And it used to scare the crap out of Israeli Jews who felt like, oh, Palestinians, they don't, or it used to give Israeli Jews an excuse to say, oh, we have no partner in peace because the Palestinians want all of Palestine and they want to expel the Jews and send them back to Europe or the United States from the river to the sea. But now that expression seems to have taken a turn, and it's being recognized that Israel is the only sovereign from the river to the sea, and the solution to I don't even want to call it a conflict because it implies parity, but the solution to the crisis in Israel-Palestine is a solution that needs to happen from the river to the sea, that the solution cannot be truncated into different territories. So I'll just end with two more points. In addition to the really phenomenal centering of Palestinian voices and the accessibility of Palestinian voices in the mainstream media, and so many Palestinians are writing in the New York Times and the Washington Post and are getting invited to webinars, and we're hearing from people in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem and Haifa and Akka and Jaffa and all of these different places. In addition to that, I think there's also something to watch out for in a good way for the in terms of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that is beginning to speak up and talk in serious ways about stopping weapons sales, even though that bill failed to pass that AOC proposed. So I think that's something that's going to be really, really important to watch as the weeks and months go forward. And I also just want to give, I want to recognize the growing visibility of Jewish anti-Zionist voices in the conversation and in alliance with and in partnership with Palestinian activists, both in the diaspora and to a very small extent in Israel. And those voices are also saying the same thing, that we need a solution from the river to the sea, and that solution needs to be equality. Now, some people will say, well, Palestinians in the West Bank want a state before they want the state of their own before they want to worry about equality with Jews. And that's a conversation that is not mine to have. But I think that everyone recognizes that all peoples in the region deserve freedom and dignity. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shira. Karam?
Yes, thank you, Alexander, and thank you, Shira. So I have a couple of comments to kind of echo what Shira has mentioned in relation to the Jewish American community. There's a new generation, effectively, that sees the connection with Israel in a different light, because for the longest time, obviously, there was this natural connection that has been emphasized by design to strengthen the relationship between Jewish Americans, young Jewish Americans, through birthright, trips, etc. And in some ways, it created an opportunity for Israeli policy to become part of the American political discourse, among other things. I mean, there are evangelical Christians that have this connection to the state of Israel through their biblical belief, etc. But I want to mention that the fiercest critics of the state of Israel have been Jewish Americans. I mean, there are different groups that have addressed the brutality of Israeli occupation and have talked about what Shira has mentioned, a solution from the river to the sea. In particular, some of those groups are Jewish Voices for Peace, of course. If Not Now is another organization. And those organizations are very important. I mean, we have to also center these voices within the Jewish American community. Those who are pushing the boundaries of the conversations within the Jewish American community are really having to deal with a lot of backlash. If I have to recognize that. At the same time, centering Palestinian voices in relation to their own struggle is something significant and important, and it has allowed effectively the American public, but also the international community, to see the story of Palestinians told by Palestinians. For the longest time, Palestinians are not at the table when decisions are being made about their very own fate. And that has unfortunately happened time and time again. If the grounds are shifting, as some people have dubbed this, it is around centering Palestinian voices and understanding that the brutality of Israeli occupation is one that has been witnessed around the world time and time again. And the framing of those conversations have changed. 10 years ago, you wouldn't be able to have a similar type of coverage in relation to Palestine and Israel as you do today. So that's very important in terms of changing in terms of the dynamic in relation to Palestine and Israel. And in addition to this, some people have asked me over and over, why is it that Jewish Americans are having this new views in relation to Israel? But I would say this has existed for a long time as well. It has existed within the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, for example, the idea of fixing the world, healing the world. It's something that is an ethic that a lot of Jews have actually pursued. So something social justice is centered in terms of some of Jewish Americans' identity. And their fight for Palestinian justice is one that is centered around that. Another thing that I would like to mention is the one last point, if I may, is that if you look at public opinion surveys of Palestinians and the idea of linked fate, I've done one in 2013 to correspond with the 20th anniversary of the Oslo Accords, to look at Palestinian views on a variety of different things, right? One of those things that I measured was something that is typically done when we study ethnic and racial politics in the United States, something called linked fate. So effectively to ask people whether something that happens to another co-ethnic or co-religious, let's say, imagine we're asking Jewish Americans about their views and whether or not they feel that what happens to other Jewish Americans affects their lives. So similarly, if you ask a Latinx person whether or not they feel that what happens to another Latinx person affects their life, you find that Palestinians consistently score quite high. And that is across the board. I'm not talking that this is between Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but it's a universal idea that Palestinians see themselves as unified in some ways in the struggle against the colonial machine of Israel, of Zionism, right? So linked fate is something quite significant in terms of Palestinian identity. And effectively, that means that if something happens to people in Gaza, people in 1948 will feel that as a threat as well, because they are the same people and they see it as such. Similarly, people in exile in the diaspora feel in similar ways that if something happens to Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, or 1948, that it also affects their lives as well. So it's something to highlight that the Palestinian resilience is one that has existed in a transnational setting. And in some ways, it's not unique to Palestinians, but it's unique that Palestinians are also still one of the very few remaining people who are still living under settler colonial policies, and in some ways they need to find solutions for this that are outside the box, if I may. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Great, thank you both very much indeed. I'm now going to turn to some of the questions that people have been submitting. Thank you to everybody who has, and my apologies up front if I don't get the question or don't get it quite like you wanted it. I'm obviously going to be abusing my privilege as the reader. there's a number of questions where people have asked about solutions, and I think we should address that second, perhaps, towards the end of the kind of hour and a bit. The question that's come up a couple of times has been like, how do you both think about the history of Palestinian military decisions or military actions? Like, if you and how do you connect that, on the one hand, kind of historically, maybe this is to Shira, and on the other hand, how do you connect that to attitudes and discourses in the United States of America? So, I mean, thinking historically, we have all these moments in the sort of 60s and 70s where Palestinian military struggle was seen as internationally as part and parcel of a global struggle, Cuban revolutionaries in Latin America, and then that military choice had a certain international reception. Again, when we come to more recently and thinking in terms of America and in terms of Islam and white attitudes to Islam in the United States, and we think about the history of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, and again, particular choices about nonviolent resistance, military resistance, the reception that those choices about military resistance had, the role that Hamas is playing today in the Palestinian discourse and the military choices that Hamas is making. Like, how do you see that kind of playing out? Yeah, in both cases. I don't know whoever wants to take it first.
Karam, do you want to try to take that on? It's a lot.
No, sure, I'll take it. Look, oftentimes I'm going to speak as a historian here at some point. I was a social historian, so I'm going to speak as a historian. It depends on how you look at the evidence, what you exclude and what you include in terms of how you frame and evaluate a particular question, right? So oftentimes you hear about, in some ways, talking about how Palestinians have reacted to Israeli occupation, that they have used the language of violence. And in some ways, it's quite racist to only say that Palestinians used only the language of violence, because if anything, I've written an article about it, if anything, Palestinians have utilized a wide range of different modes of resistance, at the center of which is non-violent forms of resistance. I think BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, is a manifestation of some of those ideas, right? Because it actually says you should, from that perspective, you should think about what it means for people to support companies that benefit from the destruction of a community, from criminalizing a particular community. And also to make a conscious decision over whether you buy certain things at your supermarket, or what kind of hummus you buy, and what kind of falafel you should buy, etc. And people make a decision, and that's quite important in terms of that idea, right? Boycott, right? So one thing I found in my research in relation to nonviolence, and I'm not necessarily saying that Palestinians have not used violence, they have. There are books that have been written about it. I mean, Yazid Sayer's book, The Armed Struggle, is a very thick book that talks about the kind of adoption of in particular about the use of violence in terms of the Palestinian struggle. However, I also want to say that my own research that I have done, I've asked whether or not people support violence, support nonviolence, support lobbying for their causes in international context, to the people, to the government. What are the rates of support in relation to that? And I found that actually it's quite high, that people say that, you know, nonviolent modes of resistance are ones that are that we should center at the heart of this. And as I mentioned in my talk earlier, or presentation or commentary, if I may, I mentioned that there's something that happened around the early 2000s. I think the intentional, I mean, the post 9/11 world was a very difficult world. It has been, it continues to be a very difficult world in terms of security, in terms of surveillance, in terms of racialization. not only of Muslims in the United States, but anyone that is even remotely connected to anyone Muslim and anyone that is remotely connected to the region, etc. So that effectively made Palestinians, or actually subjugated Palestinians in the West Bank to a greater level of violence, which, as I mentioned, it necessitated thinking outside the box to figure out ways and methods and strategic kind of decisions as to what are the best ways to move forward addressing the grievances of Palestinians. So at the same time, I'm not necessarily saying that violence has not been used. Violence has been, just like all other liberation movements around the world, Palestinians are using this. But I also think that singling out one particular mode of resistance is not appropriate, and it's not good scientific research from my perspective. So, thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. Shira, would you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just add that, Hamas emerged, in terms of the present, Hamas emerged in a certain context, which was the sort of the crumbling of the PLO, of Fatah, which dominated the PLO and has dominated it since 1967. Hamas had emerged in a moment when the PLO had failed the Palestinians in the occupied territories because the occupation hadn't ended. Actually, it emerged during the first Intifada, but it became a powerful political force at the end of the Oslo, in the late 1990s. And if Hamas hadn't emerged to fight, to sort of contest the authority of Fatah and the PLO over the Palestinian people, another group would have emerged to contest them. The problem, Hamas is certainly, I mean, I wouldn't want to live under Hamas rule for lots of different reasons. And I don't want anyone to die. I don't want Israeli children to die, but I also don't want Palestinian children to die. And if Hamas did not exist, another group would have emerged to take its place. And it's important to understand the original reasons for the emergence of Hamas. Hamas was also the Islamists in Palestine were cultivated in the Gaza Strip, especially, but also in the West Bank in the 1980s as a counterweight to the secular PLO, as a way to divide and rule the Palestinians and to fragment them politically. So I don't think there's much to be gained from focusing on what about Hamas, what about Hamas, what about Hamas, because that's actually a distraction from the structural roots of the problem.
Great, thank you. I think one of the most valuable things that came out of the discussion from both of you was the focus, or was the centering of Palestinian experiences inside Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, sometimes referred to as Arab Israelis. And both of you also mentioned the left-wing groupings in Israel. So if you think of the last kind of few months, and you think of the moment that members of the Communist Party, members of Hadash, Jabha, or members of groups like Ta'ayosh, these groups that are working towards coexistence, for the Palestinian minority, and are facing, disagreements within the Palestinian minority as to whether that's the correct strategy for the Palestinian minority. The difference in the position those voices are in now, as opposed to the position those voices were in a month or two ago, before this recent episode of violence and the Israeli attack on Gaza and the amount of people that were killed. I don't know, how do you see that playing out in the next few years? If you think of the period from like the protests in 2000 that started with Palestinians inside Israel in 2000 and then turned into the Intifada, and then you think of what happened in the intervening period, and then you think of this recent eruption of violence. How do you see that playing out?
You want to take that, Shira? Take that.
Yeah, sure. So I've been watching a lot of webinars over the last few weeks, like everyone else, and I've been hearing from I've been listening to a lot of Palestinian citizen activists from inside. And one of the things that I'm hearing a lot about is the ways in which the younger generation of Palestinians who are now every night going into the street, or who are doing community activities and community organizing, trying to defend their neighborhoods and their homes from mob assaults and vigilante violence and police violence and settler violence. Settlers from the West Bank have been coming in and attacking Palestinian neighborhoods Palestinians in their own homes and neighborhoods inside 48 Israel. One of the things I've been hearing about this is that the younger generation of people in the street now are rejecting the politics of their elders, of the sort of traditional Palestinian political formations that represented them. Not only the Communist Party, which has a kind of complicated history in relation to the State of Israel and Zionism, but also the Islamist Party, and also the members of the Joint List, which include the Balad Party, Tajammu'a, which really became well known for its slogan, demanding the state of all of its citizens. And I think the problem is that none of the Palestinian political parties until now have figured out a way to challenge the structures of Jewish supremacy. And so, and they haven't also figured out a way to link the concerns of Palestinians inside 48 Israel with the concerns of Palestinians, the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem in terms of the West Bank. And I think that, I mean, one of the things, you know, and you were referencing a lot of the questions about solutions. And I think that one of the hard things about this moment is that no one knows what the solution is. We know that the solution needs to entail new political formations. We know that the solution needs to entail political organizing and not military organizing, because even if, regardless of the debate that Palestinians have over the morality of political violence against Israelis, whether it be soldiers or civilians, violence doesn't work for Palestinians. It hasn't worked pretty much for most of the Palestinian history. It has caused some changes in Israeli policy, but for the most part, Israel, because it's always been more powerful, just comes back with more force. So if only for pragmatic reasons, Palestinians have to choose a political strategy over a military one, then the political solutions that have been on offer for the last 50 years or the last 20 years are not working. And so when I ask sometimes on these webinars, well, what are the possibilities here? What kinds of things can Palestinians inside 1948 Israel or inside the West Bank or East Jerusalem or Gaza, what can they do? What's actually possible given the imbalance of power on the ground? I don't always get a clear answer. And I don't think there is a clear answer, right? I think that there are a lot of different moving parts. People are trying to survive police assaults and bombings, and they're trying to figure it out. But I think that, you know, it's possible that a year from now or 6 months from now, we'll say, well, that was a blip on the screen and that everyone's gone back to their own sort of immediate problem. Palestinians and Israeli activists have gone back to their immediate problems, the siege on Gaza, occupation and annexation of the West Bank, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that Palestinians in all different parts of the territory that Israel rules, from the river to the sea, are talking to each other. This is my sense based on what I hear, are talking to each other in new and interesting ways, and they're trying to figure this out. So I don't have the answer to what as I like to say, it's above my pay grade. Oh, I have a visitor. It's above my pay grade to, good night. It's above my pay grade to predict the future because I'm a historian, and that's an easy out, right? But I don't know what the future holds, but I think this is an important moment that we need to pay attention to, and we need to give honor to. So.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, Karam, yeah, several people asked exactly what Shira was saying there, like new political groupings, new people, like what are the next generation saying on social media? Like, yeah, what would you say?
So I think the presence of Palestinians and those who are advocating for the struggle of the Palestinians and trying to shed light at it are very important. I mean, in terms of changing the story that is out there. And I also want to mention that I misspoke when I mentioned that Palestinians are one of the last remaining people who are colonized. I would like to acknowledge that we, as you mentioned at the the beginning of this webinar, that we live on unceded indigenous land. So I apologize for mentioning that only Palestinians are ones who remain, living under settler colonialism. And the same thing with Hawaii, for example. I mean, there's an ongoing struggle of indigenous politics and indigenous peoples fighting for their rights and to liberate their own land. So I stand corrected. But in addressing your particular specific question with regards to the significance of social media, one thing I want to mention is that it's not only that social media itself is the one that is the catalyst of change. I mean, often times, the Facebook is credited for the rise of thousands of people and millions of people in the Arabic-speaking world in relation to the so-called Arab Spring or the Arab revolts. But one thing we need to remember is that there are people who have agency and they have been trying to do what they can to address authoritarianism and policies that target them and be it under Israeli occupation or elsewhere. So it is very important to advocate for the voices of the marginalized. And I think the increasing levels of solidarity that has been taking place is quite significant in regards to this. Now, I also want to mention, if I may, the question of solutions. No one knows the solution, but as Shira mentioned, there needs to be a new political formulation. But all observers and analysts and people who study the question of Palestine and Israel have all been kind of advocating for a new way to think about the issue, right? And it's not one around only the two-state solution, the so-called two-state solution, because increasingly, actually all rational scholars of Palestine and Israel recognize that that's an impossibility right now. To figure out a solution from the river to the sea is not one that is meant to exclude the Jewish people, or as it was meant back in the day, or even interpreted in that light, but to think of a paradigm that is fully accepted around the world of equality, right? If there's one equal political system that operates, that gives people equal rights. And I think, honestly, Palestinians tried occupation, say, in the West Bank and Gaza, tried it for about 20 years, from 1967 to 1987. But, that experience was pretty messed up, because effectively Palestinians recognized that, okay, well, this isn't gonna go well, this isn't working well. Settlements have started taking roots in the early 70s, actually in Hebron and Khalil, and in other places, and it started kind of expanding. I mean, we have 440 settlements, give or take, right? And some are very, very small, and then some are literal cities. I mean, I'm talking cities with tens and tens of thousands of people, okay? So we have to take that into consideration. How do you actually bring two people together? Now, recognizing the 20th century and the misery that it has brought to a great deal of people around the world, we also recognize that thinking through these solutions isn't easy, but to come up with something very innovative around restorative justice, if I may, right? To think about justice at the heart of this. How does one come to live, who happens to be Palestinian, indigenous Palestinian from Haifa, okay, to return to their homeland and live in the same apartment building right next door to someone who's an Israeli Jewish person whose grandparents have moved, say, from Poland, escaping persecution? How do you actually create a community based on these two ideas in an equitable, where you have justice at the center of it?
Thank you, Karam. That's brilliant. Shira, would...
I'll take another question. I don't think.
Okay, yeah. Another question that came up was a couple of people asked about the region, about neighboring states. How does that fit into the equation?
Yeah, the neighboring states no longer fit into the equation. I mean, they've been out for some time. Jordan gave up its claims to the West Bank and all of its leverage. First, it gave up its claims on the West Bank in 1987, and then in the it gave up any leverage that it may have had when it when it came to when it agreed to sign a peace treaty with Israel. It's just like Egypt lost its leverage. Syria has been embroiled in civil war since for over a decade now. Is it almost a decade? Or maybe exactly a decade. And a long time before that, in 1976, Syria intervened in the Lebanon civil war to the great detriment of Palestinian refugees. So I think that there's still a lot of public support in Syria or among Syrians, millions of whom are displaced, for the Palestinian people. But the Syrian regime mostly only used the Palestinian cause as a way to distract Syrian citizens from the repression at home. Lebanon is a failed state. It always had a complicated relationship with Palestine and the question of Israel, because that's a different story. I mean, Palestinians have no one but themselves right now. And there's still the question of American leverage and European leverage and global support through things like boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I think that a lot of this conversation, I mean, we have barely discussed the United States in this conversation, because I personally felt like it was important to understand what was happening on the ground and what had been happening on the ground. But so many activists in Israel and Palestine will say that, you know, many of them anyway, will say like the struggle is in your home. To me, you know, the struggle is with the American government and the American Congress. And so in terms of, you know, there was a question that came up a few minutes ago, like that in the chat that I saw, that, you know, what can people do to help? And, you know, call your congressman, educate yourself, educate your community, stand up when you see propaganda being repeated and invoked. Always center Palestinian voices and give them platforms in which to speak at community organizations and in, I don't know, community panels, things like that. I mean, there's a debate about how much information matters in terms of the ability to change policy, but I think that we're seeing a lot of change in the discourse right now. Whether or not that leads to political change remains to be seen, but it is encouraging that a lot of the scholarly and political work that's been done over the last 20, 25 years seems to be mainstreamed now into the public conversation about Israel-Palestine. So that's possibly helpful. I mean, I'm a little bit cynical, I guess, about my own role in the conversation. I don't want to imagine that I make a difference in what I do, but I think students, for example, are more eager than ever before to understand what on earth is going on in that place. And you know, I've had several of my students have written me emails over the last few weeks saying, I'm so grateful I took your course, Professor Robinson, 3 years ago. I don't know if you remember me, but I feel like I'm able to understand what's going on now. Will they do anything with that understanding? I don't know. But we should try to force people to do something based on their understanding, including ourselves.
Karam? I mean, all right.
Sure. I mean, I can address the diaspora and the question of Palestinians, and we're actually talk about the Arab world in general. I mean, for the longest time, the question of Palestine and Israel was framed in the politics of the Arab world on the one hand, and in this small little country, Israel, right? That effectively, that they're going to be pushed into the sea, and it's a sea of contentious world and tumultuous politics that are out there to get Israel. Okay, but as far as I'm concerned, this narrative has really failed. I mean, because it's actually not true. As you know, there are a lot of connections between Israel and now a number of Arab countries. So, in a sense, the question of Palestine is one that relates to Palestinians in Palestine. That relates to that particular territory, mandatory Palestine, before 1948. okay? So it's not necessarily one that, that can be addressed through building an alliance necessarily with the United Arab Emirates or Oman or another country for that matter, right? Or, I mean, if the Egyptian experiment can tell us anything, it tells us that this is a cold peace, you know? The people are one thing and governments are another. And if anything, I think I want to give credit to Palestinians living in Palestine, right? I want to give them a great deal of credit because they actually understand the political formulations of this complex world. And they also are able to understand the suffering of other peoples. And they're able effectively to start articulating their own message, in ways that are understandable to other people, okay? And this is the reason why you find the Arab masses, and I'm talking about the Arab peoples, and not necessarily the Arab people, I mean, not necessarily their governments or their states per se. Arabs in the Arabic-speaking world are ones that are very sympathetic to the question of Palestine, but we all understand that authoritarian regimes are ones that continuously silence these voices and censors any critique of the policies of these governments. So we have to take that into consideration when we're thinking about Arab politics. Arab politics is one thing that is related to Palestinian politics for sure. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that the ones who are paying the price are Palestinians. And Palestinians have recognized that a long time ago. I mean, they recognized that they needed to come up with solutions. In fact, the diaspora came to the rescue in some way, right? But then also thanks to the ability of people to take a video on their telephones and cell phones and send it around the world. So effectively those pieces of evidence that you never see on primetime news channels, now you see that quite readily. And the failure of traditional media has been quite instrumental, if I may, in creating the space for the quote unquote the democratization of media, if I may, right? And that centers Palestinian voices, especially through networks of solidarity with Native Americans, with Black Lives Matter, and other groups around the world. And it's not only about the United States per se. These solidarity networks extend different continents, as we all know. But the centrality of the US is also significant because the US gives $3.8 billion a year to Israel. And one way or another, people have to understand that their taxes pay for this. And what they do with it is something different. I mean, what they do with it is another story. But I would like to think that people have agency and they can do something about it. They can pick up the phone and call their representatives or try to do their own kind of teaching about what they know about the situation to others.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're going to take, I think, one last question, which is that building on what Karam said about restorative justice, how might a process work towards recognition of the crime? I mean, the apartheid, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, genocide, how might restorative justice happen?
Karam, that's you.
Yeah, I wanted to give it to the historian, but it's really difficult. I happen to be Palestinian, and I think that we have to think in some ways of restorative justice at the heart of this, because we have been effectively people who have been targeted and racialized, not only by Israel, we've been racialized everywhere, right? Including the United States. I mean, saying you're Palestinian in the United States is really kind of will solicit sort of, suspicion. Let's put it that way. First of all, there needs to be a recognition of the fact that Zionism is a problem. That is an exclusionary ideology. And I understand that a lot of people are basically fed these ideas. And I'm not saying that it's easy to kind of come to terms with these realities. It's very hard to challenge one's beliefs, especially I've spent a lot of time thinking about if I were a Jewish American and I was trained, not necessarily trained, but rather has been exposed to certain type of narrative. How do I challenge that narrative if I see something that is completely contradictory to it? I think there's a moment of recognition that individuals and groups have to come to terms with before we move forward. I mean, there needs to be a recognition over the fact that Zionism is exclusionary, period. And whether or not, I mean, you can either be a Jewish state or a democracy. And you have to figure one of those, one or the other, and effectively, I mean, I don't necessarily, I mean, I'm optimistic, but I also recognize that optimism needs to be, be coupled with caution as well, because it may not go in that direction. It all depends on a variety of factors, one of which is how the United States government deals with it. I mean, hypothetically speaking, if Blinken, who's been having conversations with Palestinian leaders and Israeli leaders, if they were able effectively to kind of, in some ways, using the same analogy that I used earlier, to silence the voices by creating new concessions for Palestinians, for example, that Israel would say, okay, fine, less checkpoints in this area, more to kind of reformulate what the current circumstances or the current status quo. It doesn't really solve the problem. The problem is occupation. The problem is targeting a particular identity and centering another political identity. So it's very hard for most Americans to grasp this concept, given the fact that there's a great deal of learning that takes place in relation to how Palestine and Israel are being discussed. I mean, the word Palestine 20 years ago, you say it, you'll be chased out of lecture halls, right? Just to say that term, to say the word Palestine. And we need to come to terms with these things. Just the fact that we don't talk about it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Tremendous. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you both ever so much. Thank you to everybody who took part. I would like to say that in the next two panels, we're going to be dealing with several of the issues that Karam and Shira brought up. We're going to be talking about infrastructure, authoritarianism, the history of capitalism in the region. The panelists will be watching this panel, so they'll be able to keep the conversation going. And exactly what Karam said, it's a process. Thank you both ever so much. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much.
See you at the next panel.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Shira.
Thanks, Karam. Thanks,
Thank you.
Alexander.
Great to see you.